I'm going to orient the talk tonight around the ethics of free speech. We've talked a lot about, or thought a lot about, let's say, the right to free speech, and something you might want to also consider the obligation to free speech, because I actually think it's deeper than a right. I think you're obligated to speak freely, because otherwise people don't have the benefit of your whatever wisdom you possess. And at least you possess the wisdom of your own experience. At the very least you have that, and that's as valid a form of truth as any other form of truth, and it's often a truth that can be usefully communicated to other people. And so it's to the community's benefit that you say what your experience has taught you, because there isn't anyone who has experience like you. And one of the things that I've learned from being a clinical psychologist, but I would say more specifically from being a very careful listener, is that if you listen to people and they can talk to you, they tell you the most amazing things. You know, my typical week, I compare my work. Even today, you know, I was speaking to 4 different people. They're supporters of mine online, and I meet with some of them. And I had 4 conversations that were just absolutely profound, you know. And it's so interesting, because if people are allowed, encouraged to express themselves, and that's something that you can do by listening to someone, they open up, and it's as interesting as a Dostoevsky novel. People's actual lives are extraordinarily interesting, and it's important that they can speak freely about them, because then they can tell you all the things they know that you don't know, and then you get to know them, and that's such a good deal. So I'm going to tell you some things that I believe to be true, and that will constitute the backbone of this talk. So the first thing is that life is suffering. And then I would say that this is my attempt to reconcile the existence of multiple transcendent virtues. Transcendent virtues are the lights that guide you through your life, essentially, the principles by which it's necessary to live if you're going to have a life that's meaningful and profound and beneficial. And there are multiple transcendent values, and it isn't clear how they relate to one another. And this is my attempt to understand how they relate. And so I started with the truth that I believe to be supreme, which is that life is suffering. And then that love is the desire to see unnecessary suffering ameliorated. And that truth is the handmaiden of love. And that dialogue is the pathway to truth. And that humility is recognition of personal insufficiency and the willingness to learn. And that to learn is to die voluntarily and be born again in great ways and small. So speech must be untrammeled so that dialogue can take place, so that we can all humbly learn, so that truth can serve love, so that suffering can be ameliorated, so that we can all stumble forward, so to speak, to the kingdom of God. So I'll try to unpack that. Well, I think the idea that life is suffering comes as no surprise to anyone. In my estimation, there's 2 reasons for that. One seems to have to do with the structure of being itself. And by that I mean, there seems to be something about limitation that's required for existence. And it's a difficult notion to make clear, but I can tell you a little story about what I thought when my son was young, when he was maybe 3 years old. I thought he was a remarkable creature. I thought the same about my daughter. There's something remarkable about little kids. You know, they're little beacons of enthusiasm and wonder, I suppose. And although it takes great effort to care for them, they repay you partly by their enthusiasm and partly by the fact that they look at the world as if it's a new thing, and that allows you to do the same thing when you're around them. And so they refresh the world for you, and that's a great thing. Now, of course, if you're a parent, one of the things that's frightening about your children is that they're vulnerable. And that's part of the burden of responsibility that's associated with being a parent. But then, and you might think about that vulnerability as a liability. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it. But then I thought, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, that it's only a liability, because maybe you would like your child not to be vulnerable. And then I thought that through in a practical manner, I suppose. I thought, well, because I was worried, he'd go out in the street and a car would run over him, or he'd go into the playground and some bully would knock him over, a dog would bite him or something like that, And of course, little kids are always bumping themselves and falling downstairs and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, what would you have to do to have a little being that didn't have those problems? And, well, I thought, well, you could give him like a superhuman intelligence. That would be a start. And he could be 20 feet tall instead of 3 feet tall, and he could be encased in titanium, and he could be made invulnerable or near invulnerable. But the problem with that is that you have to replace what he was piece by piece until there was nothing left of him. And so that was partly when I realized, because realizations like this of course unfold over time, that when you deeply care for someone, you don't care for them despite their vulnerability. You care for them with the knowledge that their vulnerability is an intrinsic part of them. You care for the remarkable fact of their weakness and specificity just as much as you care for them for whatever abilities they bring to bear, whatever capacities they have. And so to love someone is to simultaneously accept their vulnerability as a valid part of their being. And that's a necessary thing to do in life, because life is suffering. But without it, without the vulnerability that brings suffering, then there doesn't seem to be any possibility of individual existence. And so, to me, it seems that in order for us to exist as individuals in some fundamentally real sense, we have to be limited in precisely the manner that we are limited, and that being in some sense requires that limitation and that vulnerability. There's an old idea, I don't remember where I read it, it was many years ago. I think it was from Jewish commentary on the Torah. It was like a Zen koan almost. The question was, what does a being with the classical attributes of God, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, what does a being like that lack? And it's a very interesting question, because of course, obviously, the obvious answer is, well, nothing. But that's the wrong answer. The right answer is that a being like that lacks limitation. And the commentator was putting that argument forward as a justification for the creation of man. And I thought that was a spectacularly brilliant insight, that there's something that lacks nothing lacks, and that's lack itself. And I read something about Kierkegaard, something written by Kierkegaard, where he said the same thing. He said that he knew himself as someone who was never going to be able to make life easy for people in the way that the great inventors of the late 19th century had made things increasingly easy for people, and so that his task was going to be to determine how it was that he could make life more difficult for people, and that he knew he would be thanked as one of the benefactors of the age for doing precisely that. And Kierkegaard attempted to, I suppose, lay a heavy moral burden on his readers, and he knew that was perhaps not something that people would appreciate immediately, but perhaps on reflection they would find that that was exactly what they wanted. And one of the things that's been very remarkable to me as I've been speaking to people recently is that because I think that I'm doing something similar, and I'm trying to lay a burden on people, and by all appearances I'm trying to lay a burden on men, and at least that's who's responding to it. I mean, you look at this audience, it's like, it must be 95% men. It's very, very interesting to me. But there's something about responsibility that's associated with the transcendence of suffering, and that's absolutely necessary for life to proceed properly.
Saudi Arabia recently ended its 50-year petrodollar deal with the US, which has the potential to weaken the US dollar. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia has sold oil solely in US dollars, which was huge for our global economic dominance. Now, they want other options. If there's less demand for the US dollar, what happens to its value? It's reasons like this that make it important to diversify some of your savings into gold, and you can do that with help from Birch Gold. For over 20 years, Birch Gold Group has helped tens of thousands of Americans protect their savings by converting an IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. To learn more, text Jordan to 989898 and claim your free, no-obligation info kit on gold. With their education-first approach, Birch Gold has earned the trust of thousands of happy customers. They understand that navigating financial decisions can be scary. That's why their dedicated in-house IRA department is there to guide you every step of the way. Protect your savings with gold. Text Jordan to 989898 and talk to one of Birch Gold's experts and claim your free info kit today. Text Jordan to 989898. That's Jordan to 989898 today.
So life is suffering because we're vulnerable, and it's also suffering, I would say, because we're evil. And I've tried to define evil. There's the tragic part of life is the fact that our vulnerability is built in, and we have psychological problems, and we have physical problems, and we all die. And that's part of the structure of existence. It's the same structure that brings about tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and natural catastrophes of all types. It's the impartial brutality of reality. And that contributes greatly to human suffering, although it may, as I said, also be a precondition for being itself. But then there's the other kind of suffering that we bring upon ourselves, and I would categorize that under the heading of malevolence. And malevolence is the desire to increase suffering in some sense for the sake of suffering itself. It's like an art form. I think that's the best way to conceptualize it. It's something aesthetic. It's the same aesthetic that drove the Nazis to put that terrible joke above the gates of Auschwitz, which was that work would make you free. And of course, the freedom that was being offered in the Nazi camps was death, and that was a great, terrible joke. And it's a very malevolent spirit that would dare to joke in that manner, but that's a spirit that we all have to contend with, because there's part of each of us that, because of the suffering that life entails, is bitter about existence and would wish, in some sense, to see it eradicated. That's something I learned from reading Goethe's great play, Faust. He has a character in there, Mephistopheles, who's sort of the intellectual version of Satan, I suppose. And Goethe has Mephistopheles attempt to explain the reason for his existence, or at least the reason for his mode of being. And Mephistopheles basically says, and Goethe has him say this twice, that because existence is characterized by such dreadful suffering, it would be better if it never existed at all. And that's what he's working to bring about. And that struck me in a very deep manner, because I had recognized by that time that life was difficult enough so that it was challenging to walk through it without becoming embittered and resentful, let's say, and then to become arrogant because of that, and then to become a judge of existence because of that. And if you ever wonder, and of course you do, what is going through the minds of people who do such things as shoot up elementary schools full of school children, knowing the things that I just described is very useful in developing some understanding, because the people who do that are resentful and bitter, and they've brooded upon it for, well, not hours, but weeks and months and years. And they conclude that existence itself is evil, and that it should be taken revenge upon. And the way that you take revenge upon existence most precisely is to find the most innocent people and punish them the most dreadfully. And that's the motive behind shooting elementary school kids in a playground, let's say. And that's a very dark place to go. But that's a place that people are perfectly capable of going. And the terrible thing is that we have the motivation to go there. And you can make a rational case for going there, but that doesn't make it the proper place to go. And that brings me to the second point, which is that love is the desire to see unnecessary suffering ameliorated. Love is a very difficult word to use because in some sense it's been mouthed to death. You know, it's such a commonplace. And if you're attempting to affect virtue, then the first thing you do is speak about love, and it's very difficult to speak about love without feeling, I would say, self-contempt, really, because it is a word that's misused so badly. But I'd like to offer a technical definition of it and then put it into proper relationship with what I already discussed. If hatred is the desire to see being eliminated because of its catastrophe, then love is the desire to see being elevated, maybe even because of that suffering, and to say that the proper orientation in life is to work diligently for the alleviation of unnecessary suffering and to make that the core element of your being, your actual aim, because you need an aim. Everyone needs an aim. We're creatures who are evolved to aim. We're hunters, for that matter, and we need a target to aim at. We're not ever oriented properly without an aim. And then you might say, well, why not choose an aim that is everything that you could possibly want it to be? And I would say that is what you want to do, because, first of all, being miserable and vulnerable and subject to catastrophe and decay, it's easy to sink into self-contempt and misery, self-conscious misery. And I think the only way out of that is to voluntarily shoulder a burden that the shouldering of grants you some respect for your own existence. And so then you think, well, the way forward confidently is to find the biggest load that you can possibly lift, and then lift it, and then walk forward with it, because then you can see that there's something to you that transcends your vulnerability and ennobles the world and works against the very terrible problems of both suffering and malevolence that might drive you to despair to begin with. And so when I'm working with my clinical clients, and I think when I'm speaking to people in general, when I'm properly oriented, this is a development of thought that was originally laid down in part by Carl Rogers, although he was deeply influenced by his Christian background. He was a very famous psychologist, and he said that the way to treat people in therapy is with unconditional positive regard. And I would say that that's a noble formulation, but it's erroneous, because that isn't exactly, in my estimation, what you should do with people. And I don't think it's what I do with people. What I do with people is to try to find the part of them that is striving towards the light and that would like being itself to be elevated and ennobled and suffering ameliorated, especially the unnecessary suffering, and then form an alliance with that and communicate with that and encourage that, which is what I think you do to people that you love. And you can't do that if there's bitterness in your heart, because that's actually the part that you want to destroy if you're bitter. As the story of Cain and Abel tells us, in a terribly brief period of time, with terrible power. You replace contempt for being and resentment and hatred for being with love, and that's the desire to see the good flourish in you and in others. And I don't mean the good in that smarmy and contemptible manner that it's often presented. I mean the good as the culmination of brilliant awareness and courage and strength that it really is, and that you would wish to bring forward in everyone, to encourage in everyone, if you were oriented properly in the world.